Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line. The Russians made a significant advance in the southern parts of the Donetsk region, gaining control over approximately 30 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory within a single night. The Russians launched an assault from a southern bank of the Vovcha river line, and geolocated footage confirms the entry into the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the eastern section of the front line, the Ukrainians made a small counterattack in the Dnipro direction, regaining control over much of the small town. The Russians managed to expand zone of control west of the Varishna in the western bank of the river line, and there was a small correction of the front line to the south of Kupiansk. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians managed to gain control over the fortified positions east of Komar. This allowed the Russians to gain full control over the highway from Odradne onwards towards the northern flank of Komar. This indicates that the Russians will likely gain full control over the town of Komar and Perebudova in the coming days. Now that the Russians have additional supply routes into Komar and Perebudova just north of the town. The Russians are within by control of the intersection here north of Komar, and the river line has just one bridge across, which goes between this small residential area, this one street of Perebudova on the western bank of the river line. The Russians will have fire control over it with FPV drones, artillery, and long-range strikes. The bridge will likely be covered consistently, and the Russian positions are also present on the western bank of the river line near Fedorivka for offensive operations on the western bank of the river line. The Russians will be looking to isolate both of these towns and gain control of them before pushing onwards towards the western bank in the direction of Mirne, further upwards towards Pidupne. On the eastern bank of the river line, the Ukrainians have two fortified positions here in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, Yeltsa, and Sirka. The Russians will likely launch simultaneous offensive operations in the direction of these three villages here on the northern outskirts of the enclave, while at the same time pushing in the direction of Mirne and Pidupne in the western bank of the river line. The objective is to gain control over the area in between the two river lines to the northeast, push towards the outskirts of the region in the northwest, and then flank the towns and settlements in the rear of the fortified positions, following the control over the northern banks, and pushing into the Dnipropetrovsk region from this section of the front line as well, to bypass the main defensive lines of the Ukrainians, and also to create an opening for the road towards Pokrovsk, which is another major supply hub in the Dnipropetrovsk region, into the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here in the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians also managed to enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region here in the Vovcha river line direction. They managed to gain control over the forest lines and fields west of Odradne and upwards towards the river line, gain control over the forest patches and forest lines in this direction, capturing the fortified position south of the Vovcha river line and crossing over to raise the flag in this forest patch right here, as we see with the geolocated footage. The Russians struck the position with cluster munitions before sending in infantry to clear it, and they then raised the 114th Brigade flag, which is the same brigade that recently captured Oleksivka to the east, and the one that has been fighting all throughout from Avdiivka north of Donetsk all the way to the front line as it stands today. With this push, the Russians now have physical control over the road leading into Dashne here west of Zeleny and Novomykolaivka. This leaves just a few dirt roads to the north of the fortified positions to resupply their forces there, although the Russians do not have a strong position here in the Dashne direction within the Dnipropetrovsk region, as they have to cross over a river line. It's just a few infantry. The FPV drone operators of the Russian forces within Bahatir, Odradne, and the first lines will be able to consistently reconnaissance the highway and cut off any supplies going through it. Therefore, it is likely that the Ukrainians are unable to send any supplies through this main highway towards Novomykolaivka, Zeleny and the fortified positions. Instead, they are using the road here to the north. The Russians will likely push here west of Bogdanivka to cut off those dirt roads as well, to encircle the Ukrainian positions north of Novomykolaivka and Zeleny Gaining control over the entire border area will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions here in this section of the front line and push into the Dnipropetrovsk region in the direction of Novomykolaivka. The Russians also managed to gain control over Novomykolaivka here in the border area between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk regions. As we see with this geolocated footage, following the Russian capture of the second road into the town, they now gain control over the northern streets. This allows the Russians to start fighting in the direction of Kurakhove. Following that, it's the fortified positions, and from then on, the Russians will have full control over the border area from the Dashna direction all the way up to Novomykolaivka and Dashna in the north. This will allow the Russians to have several roads into Novomykolaivka from the south and the north, and additional pushes from the eastern flank through the open fields. The Ukrainians still hold on to Kurakhove, but the Russians are currently storming the town. The entire eastern parts of it is in the gray zone, as the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians out of it completely. The offensive operations by the Russians will likely intensify once they reach the border area to push into the Dnipropetrovsk region, gain control of Novomykolaivka, push further in the northern direction towards Myshova, and potentially also pushing along the border area near Ivanivka, combined with assaults through the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians will look to push in the direction of Peterivka and then onwards towards Pokrovsk. The Russians restarted offensive operations in the direction of Dashna, gaining control over additional parts in the western parts of the town. The Russians are here slowly advancing through the northern and southern streets to gain full control over the town, which will open up the road for the coal mine further north and Molodetske on the western outskirts of the region. The Russians are here slowly moving upwards along the border area, where they are looking to gain control over the entire border area upwards to Serhivka, onwards towards Kalinivka, Kamyanka, and then the defensive line of the Ukrainians located northwest of Pokrovsk for the operational encirclement of the city. The Russians continued offensive operations both to encircle Pokrovsk with the operational encirclement and Kupiansk. However, the Ukrainians are not standing still and are launching some counterattacks. In the direction of Delivka, they managed to regain control of the fortified positions and the town itself, as the Russians so far has failed to secure the eastern flank of the town. The Russians have been trying to expand a zone of control east of Delivka to secure the eastern flank for additional supply routes into the town. However, they have so far been unable to do so. Expanding zone of control east of the town has been successful, but creating the additional supply route into Delivka has so far failed. With the Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians have pushed to the outskirts of the town. The Russians will likely look to gain control over the western flank and eastern flanks of the town to re-enter from both of these directions, spreading out their supply lines. Having additional supply lines will allow them to storm it from multiple directions, spreading out the Ukrainian forces, and having additional supply routes in allows them to launch these assaults from a safer basis, as the Ukrainians would have a wider front to defend against. Further north in the direction of Kupiansk and Novomykolaivka, the Ukrainians, there was a map correction. The Ukrainians still hold control over the fortified positions here to the east of Zahrizove. It was previously reported that the Russians captured these. However, recent footage shows the Russians bombing some of these fortified positions in the area, which means that the Ukrainians still hold control over this section of the front line. In the direction of the Varishna, the Russians managed to secure some of the forest patches here west of the town and managed to advance along the forest lines here to the southwest of it. The advance was reported by Deep State Map, as they admitted to a lot of the Russian advances here in this section of the front line. And I say admitted because, as we can see here, the Deep State Map mapping is extremely weird nowadays. They have a massive gray zone and an even more massive Ukrainian control zone that is in reality switched hands to the Russian side. An example is the geolocated footage from today's video, where we see the Russians raising the flags here in the border area of the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians did advance from the southern flank. However, the Ukrainians still claim that they have a foothold within Bahatir and have full control over Oleksivka, despite the geolocated footage showing the Russians in control over both towns. At the same time, they do not reveal the Russian advance. At the same time, they do not admit to the Russians having control over Oderatne. They still claim that Konstantinopel and Andrivka are contested. despite the Russians getting control over additional towns further west that would make this impossible. They claim that the Russian push into Oleksivka came from the northern flank, while the Ukrainians still have a foothold in the western outskirts of Andrivka. Yet at the same time, they were the first ones to report the Russian entry into Komar. They also claim that the Russians have entered Fedorivka but have not gained full control over the town, yet the Ukrainians still control Vesele further south. These reports are so weird, it makes absolutely no sense. The Russian capture of Zelenopole in its entirety, Novopil is contested, and the Ukrainians have been encircled here for a month. Ever since Syrskyi threatened Deep State Map, the channel has been unreliable. There are some times where the reports can be used, rarely, but nowadays I practically don't use Deep State Map anymore because of, well, the untruthfulness of the site. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.